eBay Motors and ADVRider.com welcome you to episode 57 of The Lowdown Show. I'm Neil Graham. Traveler and author Sam Manicom joins me for a chat and to read excerpts from his book Into Africa. This week is part one of our conversation, and next week, you guessed it, is part two. But before we take a leap, a word from our sponsor. Picture this, you're halfway through a DIY motorcycle fix, tools scattered everywhere, and boom, you realize you're missing a part. Well, it's okay because you know whatever it is, it's on eBay. They've got everything: brake rotors, lights, and tire exhaust systems, whatever you need. And it's guaranteed to fit, which means no more crossing your fingers hoping you ordered the right thing. Get all the parts you need at prices you'll love, guaranteed to fit every time. eBay, things people love. Sam, I think one of the most misunderstood places in the world is Africa. And I've been a few times. And in fact, I drove in Zimbabwe from Harare down to South Africa years ago.
Oh, fantastic.
And the kind of the curious thing, and I'll be brief about this because I'm more interested in your stories than mine, but there was so little traffic on the road that I drove for about 50 kilometers on the wrong side of the road until my passenger screamed and said, "You're on the wrong side of the road." Because, of course, in North America, we drive on the other side of the road. And even though I should have figured it out that the steering wheel was in the ditch. Anyway, but parts of the country over towards Mozambique looked like Ireland. It was the greenest, and it was just I thought of the cliche of Africa is what I took there, which is that it's hot and sandy and kind of ruthlessly hot. When that's nothing of the case. It's an incredibly diverse continent, isn't it?
It's absolutely phenomenal. And many people think about Africa as being the dark continent, even now. Even with the number of people who are traveling through and social media posts and blogs and all of those sorts of things, which are opening up the continent beautifully to people, there's still this image of a country that's always where people are trying to kill each other, where hands are out for aid agency money, where people are lazy, and just all of those sorts of things. And what people don't realize until they really start traveling there is that it's a continent where all of your senses fire on all cylinders. That all the sounds and the smells and the way things feel and the touch and so on. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's one of the reasons that I'm a total Africa addict. The old saying is, once you've been, you're always going to go back again because the place grabs you. And yeah, you know as well as I do, you having just said what you have, exactly what people say. It is a very addictive land, isn't it? And it's totally fascinating because of the contrasts. And when you think some of the world's largest sand dunes can be found in Africa, not in the Sahara, but Namibia, down in the south west corner of southern Africa. It's got snow-topped mountains. It's got some of the deepest, darkest jungles in the world, and it's just open savannas and so on. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. Love it.
What drew you there in the first place, and what did you know? First of all, when did you first go to Africa?
I was born there.
You were born there?
It was. My parents lived and worked in Central West Africa, in the Congo. That's what it was when they first went there. And so I was born there and lived there until I was 10 years old, which was just brilliant for a kid.
Yeah.
I spent so much time running around in shorts and inevitably no t-shirt and barefoot and playing with the local kids and all of that sort of stuff. And it was probably a very good job that my parents didn't know where I was a lot of the time, because the things that small boys get up to, parents don't necessarily want to know about those things. I've never forgotten turning up at my parents one day, having been out for a few hours with the boys, and I had a snake with me, and my mother looked absolutely horrified. I didn't know this snake was one of the most poisonous snakes that you could find in southern Africa. We'd found it, we'd belted it on the head, and I'd carried it home. Look, Mum, look what I found.
Dinner.
Well, quite. Have you ever tried snake? It's very tasty.
I haven't actually.
It is very tasty. You know the old joke about meats that you don't know if they're pale tasting like chicken? Snake actually does taste like chicken.
Yeah, I think I ate a rat in Peru once, and it really tasted like a rat. So I will debate your everything tastes like chicken story a little bit, but it was stapled to this plinth, and when I have nightmares, that rat comes back at me. I think it winks. So when did you first travel in Africa as an adult on a motorcycle?
Okay, 1992. And the trip came about because I'd traveled a lot when I was in my teens and early 20s. My first solo trip was on a bicycle riding through Europe just to see where I could get in my school holidays. I was age 16, and it was the first time I'd done anything on my own. Before that, it was family trips and travels and so on. And I just thought, well, if you don't try, you'll never find out if you can. So off I went. My parents were amazing, weren't they, to let a 16-year-old
Yeah.
head off and do something like that. But that trip taught me a lot of really important things, such as it's not the destination, but it's all of the things that you see and get involved with along the way that are the real journey. They're the adventure. So that was absolutely fantastic. And it's also never be afraid of people, treat them with respect. And it's phenomenal the response that you get from people just because you've treated them that way. And another lesson was it doesn't matter whether you speak the language or not. Sign language is a mighty fine thing, and you can go a very, very long way on sign language. And I kind of made a point of saying that last one because a lot of people, I think, when they're thinking about travel, worry about the fact that they don't speak the languages of the countries that they're going to. And I think that if you treat people with respect and a handshake and a smile, people take the time out to try and understand what your sign language means. And some of it is just so simple, isn't it? It's for example, I need somewhere to sleep. Is there a hotel? Well, you do that and that, and well, it's instantly obvious what it is. I need a drink. Yeah, all right, that might be a beer or a glass of water, but I need a drink. It
Yeah,
works.
yeah.
And so all of that sort of stuff. So that trip taught me an awful lot. And I traveled in various different other ways. I hitchhiked and sailed and hiked and backpacked and so on. And I got back from a 3-year trip, and my mother was saying to me things like, "Don't you think it's time to grow up now?" And I thought, well, I suppose I probably ought to try this career lark. So settled into it
Mm.
and seemed to do quite well at it. But the itchy feet, they were still there. And after a while, I was in the pub after work one night, just having a little think about life, the world, and everything. And I had a huge stroke of luck. I drank too much beer. And having drunk too much beer loosened my mind to the extent that, hang on a minute, Sam, you don't owe anybody any money. Your family are well. You've got no kids. You've got no pets. You've got no responsibilities. You are free. Do something different now because you may never be this free again. Um, and yeah, beer's great, isn't it? Because I may not have joined all of the dots of that thought process together. And the seventh beer was the dangerous one. So what are you going to do? I'm going to ride a motorcycle through Africa. I mean, there was one problem. I didn't know how to ride a motorcycle, but
I was
hey,
going to ask you what was your history with motorcycling, but you clarified it that you had. And so, why did you choose a motorcycle? Just because it was a bigger bicycle? Was that the sort of it?
two reasons. The first reason was that having traveled in all the other different ways, I was looking for a new set of challenges. What's a different way to travel that's going to give me different opportunities? Um, I looked at all of the things that I didn't like about the other ways of traveling. I really enjoy people. And sailing, for example, I didn't see that many people when I was out in the water. And when I was on dry land for short periods of time, then I was mostly seeing yachties and people around harbours and that sort of thing. And yeah, it was just the way it worked out. Traveling by bus. How often have you been on a bus and you've gone belting past something and it looks fantastic, but you can't get off and go and look? And so I was just thinking about all of those different things and eventually came to, well, I haven't tried motorcycling. And then the other thing kicked in. When I was a teenager, I'd been banned from riding motorcycles. Um, my parents were quite smart cookies, and they knew that I would have been that kid who was in the bush on the sharp corner because I would have been that kid who tried to go around the corner as fast as possible to see how fast it was possible to get round. So I was banned, and this felt like, okay, I'm a bit grown up now. Now it's up to me to dig myself out of that hedge if I'm daft enough to get myself in it. But that actually was the hardest thing about setting off to travel down through Africa, telling my mother that I was going to do this trip. But she was absolutely brilliant. She, when I told her, and of
And
course she can,
how old were you at the time?
34.
So not a kid.
Nope, not a kid. And she was used to me bimbling off and doing this, that, and the other. But because I'd been banned from riding motorcycles, I was very nervous about how she was going to react. But she just said to me, "I knew you were cooking something.
Mm,
Motorcycling? Yeah, okay. What can I do to help?" And you just
wow.
can't wish for a better response than that, can you?
Yeah.
As far as choosing Africa, I decided that I wanted to go to Africa because the original plan was to go down the west side of Africa and go to where I was born and brought up to see what whether my childhood memories were appropriate. The sound of laughter and the way things smell and those sorts of things. And yeah, well, that plan didn't exactly work because 6 weeks before I was due to leave the UK to head off, everything closed in Algeria and all the borders and surrounding countries closed. Another civil war situation.
Yeah.
And so that sort of put the kibosh on that. But, travelers, we learn, don't we? If you can't go straight ahead, then where's plan B? Which way is plan B going to take you? And okay, well, I'll try the east side instead. But what I didn't know or have a clue of until I got as far as Nairobi was that because of the civil wars that have been going on in Sudan and Ethiopia, nobody had been that way north to south for 20 years. I wasn't setting out to break any records or anything else like that. It was just the way it was.
The Lowdown Show is presented by advrider.com and supported by ebaymotors.com. Before we get into your readings, which is I'm very much looking forward to, but one of the peculiarities about travel, especially when you look back on any kind of travel, is that it almost always involves these sort of serendipitous moments where you're steered one way and not the other way. And in the end, it almost always is the better way to have done it. Now, at least that's my very non-scientific theory about this. But it just seems that there's this kind of hand that says, that way.
Mm.
And I just love that about travel. I mean, do you share that view?
Oh, I do very much. I believe in fate, and I very much believe in silver linings. Um, the thought of something going wrong doesn't bother me because I know that fairly quickly there's something that happens or you're serendipitously dropped into a particular situation that can be far more interesting
Yeah.
than the route that you had originally planned to travel. And I think when people travel with that sort of knowledge, their journeys become adventures rather than things where they're spending a lot of time fearing the unknown.
Well, I totally agree, and I sometimes think that um, when things go to hell is when it gets interesting because I think we have to rely on our excuse me on stuff that we normally bury in society because normally in a day-to-day existence in the decadent West, it's a pretty docile way to live, really. And yeah, I think when we're on the road and stuff breaks and you're in the middle of nowhere and you've got to figure it out. And I think that figuring it out, what's going on in your brain, it's just everything is firing and there's this incredible sense of there's no option. There isn't an option to phone the assist to come and get your vehicle. You've just got to rely on yourself. And there's something can be terrifying, but incredibly invigorating about that, isn't it?
Oh, without a doubt. To me, one of the beauties of travel is that you're learning about the people, the places, and the cultures. You're being constantly surprised by the things that you're seeing, and you think, I didn't know that. I didn't have a clue. How fascinating is that? But you're also learning an awful lot about yourself and your ability to cope with things, to MacGyver things, to find solutions to situations.
Yeah.
And I think you're also taught very quickly that the people in the rest of this world aren't out to get you. What they are wanting to do is to make sure that you have a really good time in their country, and that's their ambition. And I think Ted Simon, he put it together very nicely, didn't he? He didn't really fear breaking down. He said, if I broke down, well, then I'll just sit by the side of the road and wait, and something will come along and a solution will be found. And I think that is such a good lesson. I don't like the idea of relying upon that, and I think travelers should set out with the aim of being self-sufficient, but without the fear of finding themselves where they can't solve something for themselves, because things happen.
Yeah, ineptitude should not be your policy.
No. Innocence and naivety are facts of life for many people when they set out and travel, and that's
Right.
one of the reasons that people travel, because they want to learn. You can't know everything. Nobody's an expert in everything. But having done some homework and having found out, for example, what the weather patterns are like, what the political situation is like, learned as much as possible about road conditions and availability of gas and water and those sorts of things, they're all really important to learn in advance where at all possible. But you can't learn everything before you hit the road. So you head out and you travel gently and you pay attention and you talk to people, and the knowledge comes and you just build on that knowledge, don't you?
Well, Sam, I'm looking forward to hearing your writing, and I've read much of your stuff, and it's beautiful visual storytelling. And why don't you set up the first little piece you're going to read for us? Just
Okay.
frame it up for us, and then and jump right into it, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, fantastic. We'll do. So this section is we're in Sudan, and I'm heading for Ethiopia. It's a desert landscape, and I'm riding with an English couple called Mike and Sally. Now, I linked up with Mike and Sally on the ferry going between Greece and Egypt. To my amazement, there were 50 motorcycles on this ferry heading for Egypt, and back in 1992, there weren't an awful lot of people doing this sort of thing, and there wasn't the internet and so on. So I thought I was doing something pretty unusual. So suddenly find 50 motorcycles was a bit of a, oh, right, okay. Oh well, if I fall off, there'll be somebody to help me pick the bike up. But it turned out that out of all of those 50 bikes, Mike and Sally were the only ones that were heading south of Egypt. So we decided to link up and travel together for a little while. I celebrated my 3-month anniversary on a motorcycle, sitting at the edge of the Sahara Desert on day one in Africa, looking south over the sand, thinking, Sam, you prat, what are you doing? You haven't got a clue. So this little excerpt comes about 5 weeks later. So we're in Sudan and heading for Ethiopia. And it's been sheer fluke getting hold of a visa to get into Sudan in the first place, and sheer fluke getting visas to get into Ethiopia. The road that ran from Khartoum down into the southeast of Sudan and towards the border with Ethiopia was asphalt. But then you get to a town called Gedaref, and then the road turns to dirt and sand. So we had headed off south of the city, or overgrown town really, which had the water supply turned off, by the way. So filling our water bottles was a very slow, painful drip by drip process, and no signposts at the bottom of the town. So we basically had to get the compass out and work out which was the best route that we hoped that we should be on. So here we go. After a while, the tracks started to twist and turn for no apparent reason. The soil in the corners had been pounded into a fine, deep dust by the heavily overloaded trucks that kept the villagers supplied and acted as the local bus service. The battle for us was with a combination of deep ruts still left from the last rains, and with the soft, thick pockets of dust that would instantly suck power. They were rather like riding into baths full of talcum powder. Mike's motocross experience paid off, but we both fell. The track was so soft that on one occasion, the only way to get the bike upright again had been to scoop holes under the wheels and then push them into it. The struggle was then how to get the now upright bikes out of the holes. A stop-go rocking motion and a shove seemed to be the best way to do that. Another notch on the learning belt. But I was glad that the imminent rains hadn't started. This section would have been a black quagmire. So far, at each unmarked junction, the compass had kept us heading in the right direction. Then in front were 5 tracks, 3 of which could have been right. We needed a 3-sided coin. Half an hour later, we realised that the track that had been the best bet had turned west and didn't look as if it was going to twist back again. We needed southeast, and nothing else would do. Time was marching on desperately fast. The road conditions were making the bikes drink fuel much faster than I thought possible, and the lack of shade and the intense heat was making sweat pour off us. We stopped to drink another litre of warm, decidedly odd-tasting water. Going back and hoping to find the right turning was out of the question. It would eat too much time. The only choice was to ride through the chest-high, scrubby bush and hope that we would cut across the right track and miss picking up any thorns. We were already feeling tired and weren't even halfway through the day's ride. The chase across the bush was a brain tease. Common sense kept saying, slow down, take it easy. A broken leg, or indeed a broken bike at this stage, would have been a disaster. But it was another don't think about it moment. Don't dwell, just go. Knobbly tyres and a lot less weight would have helped, but the BMW's power compensated for my fear and lack of experience. By the time we humped across a new track, my trousers were ripped around the knees and my legs were scratched bloody from the low-lying thorn bushes. But I'd learned some more, and the well-used track continued in the right direction. The halfway point to the border was a large village that was surrounded by fields full of withered maize and a few bony cattle. Doka was packed with excited people, and I realized that we'd crossed an invisible line. The local skin colors had changed from the light tans of the Arab world to the dark honey tans and Nubian jet of the south. Scrawny goats wandered around eating discarded orange peel, mango pips, and bits of old newspaper. The 20 or so huts were straw-roofed and walled with branches that had come from goodness knows where. I could only see 3 trees, and we hadn't seen anything even remotely resembling a forest since arriving in Africa. The gaps between the wall sticks would help keep the huts cool and would be enough of a deterrent to keep any animals out, but mosquitoes and peeping toms would have a field day. Conversation stopped dead as we rode across the bare, uneven, compacted dirt of the village centre. The Gedaref police sergeant had told us to point reports to the local cop shop, which, when we found it, was of course another straw-roofed hut. The policeman was dressed in a jalaliba, which did nothing to hide his girth. He had a young lad shifting the air around the middle of the inside of the police station with a palm frond mat that was suspended from the roof beams. The policeman didn't seem especially surprised to see us. In the corner sat a large army-type radio, so we guessed that he'd been warned that 3 crazies were heading in his direction. His manner was rather benevolent and of complete authority. Around him sat a collection of men who had the manner of courtiers attending the king. To our delight, there wasn't a trace of the aggression that we'd found in Gedaref. The police chief here advised us in a rich baritone that suited his bulk perfectly. You will have to travel to the border in a truck convoy. Bandits for you now are, to my very great regret, a serious problem. The trouble was, the convoys were few and far between, and several days' wait in the village was not something we were looking forward to. All of the delays in Khartoum hadn't left enough time on our Sudanese visas, and the big worry was still the imminent rainy season. It could hit at any moment. And that story ends up at the border between Ethiopia and between Sudan and Ethiopia, and a brigadier general throwing us out of Sudan.
Whenever there's a brigadier general, it's never a good end.
No, exactly. He was a bit red-faced and rather angry. There was a bit of fist waving going on from him.
So you were traveling. Just following up with what you just read. So you had to leave there, and you had to go down a road, which is a common thing for travelers. That it's a road that's not particularly recommended because of bandits. And how did you fare? Well, you're here, but how did that go?
It actually worked out quite well for us because just by sheer luck, a local tribal chieftain was getting married. So there were a lot of, inverted commas, good people on the road in trucks and cars and that sort of thing. and the Sudanese army had placed soldiers on the tops of all of the trees. And as we were on the tops of all of the hills, as we were riding, we could see them silhouetted up there, with the sort of classic silhouette with the sign of the gun going out at the side. And they were up there and they were watching this road on down below. And fortunately for us, the road was in much, much better condition than we'd been riding as far as Doka. So it was gravel and hard packed sand, but there were quite a few sections where there were big boulders. So you were dropping down a foot, sometimes 2 feet. And bearing in mind that I was totally inexperienced, I had no idea about riding on dirt. This was just get on with it situation. And I did surprise myself by actually managing to stay on through all of that. But this is, that whole section was quite a long story. But it was one of the funny stories. So yeah. But
what was the BMW you were riding? What model was it?
An R80 GS BMW.
Yeah.
So at that time, the bikes that were around that people were overlanding on were Africa Twins, XT660s. There were a few XT500s around, DR650 bigs, those sorts of bikes.
Yeah.
And the other ones were R80 GSs. There were quite a few people traveling on the G-Stroke S, which I didn't realize at the time was a lighter, tougher bike. I just went with a new bike because I knew nothing about motorcycling. I thought, well, actually, I better get the one that's just been released, because of that way, at least I've got a guarantee from the manufacturers. And of course, I could have bought a dog if I was buying a second-hand bike. I wouldn't have had a clue whether I was buying a good bike or not. So yeah, I headed off on my R80 GS. And I was on that bike because two guys in my local pub, one told me they were bulletproof and his mate told me they were idiot-proof. So I thought, yeah, I better have one of those.
Bulletproof and idiot-proof. Man, if we could just package that in a cologne, wouldn't we be fine?
Oh, yeah.
Let's take a short break for some words from our sponsor. Picture this. You're in the garage, your favorite room in the house, and you're tuning up your engine with parts that you found on eBay. Every piece is just locking perfectly into place. You step back to admire your work, hands covered in grease. And because you're committed to riding that thing farther than the odometer can even handle, you start thinking to yourself, you know what? I could probably use some new brakes, maybe a shock. This baby, well, it deserves a new air filter. So you head straight back to eBay. You can find anything you need there. It's unreal. From headlights to air filters to exhaust systems, all the way to those carbon fiber rims you've had in your mind. eBay is the stocked garage of your dreams. And you've got eBay Guaranteed Fit, because eBay knows DIY fixes can be major in mods. Well, they're always intense. So you need to know those parts are guaranteed to fit every time. Before you dive in, wrench first. And on the off chance you order a part and it doesn't fit, send it back. Simple as that. You know what you love more than your bike itself, and that is, of course, riding it. You're serious when it comes to engine maintenance and locked in when you're headed into a build. And that's exactly why you start with eBay. Minor fixer, complete overhaul. You want to get your ride back on the road. And you've got eBay Guaranteed Fit. So eBay created My Garage, where all you have to do is add your ride's info to get the exact parts that fit. When you see that green check, you're a click away from that part clicking perfectly into place. Well, now that you know all of this, just imagine standing at that open garage door, looking at the bike you love more than anything, knowing that anything is possible, whether it's keeping it on the road forever or turning it into something that's never been on the road before. Because with eBay, your garage just got a whole lot bigger. Get all the parts you need at prices you'll love, guaranteed to fit every time. eBay, things people love. Now back to my conversation with Sam Manicom. The Lowdown Show is presented by advrider.com and supported by ebaymotors.com. Alrighty, well, so let's carry on to your second excerpt here. What do we have this time?
Okay, so excerpt 2 is in Kenya, and it's just following the worst dirt roads that I've ever ridden. The rainy season...
Worse than the dirt road you just told us about?
Oh, yeah, far worse.
Okay, boy. Okay.
Far worse. So the background to this story is that coming into Sudan, Sally had caught dysentery, but she'd not only managed to catch bacillic dysentery, she managed to catch amoebic dysentery at the same time. So you can imagine that she was in a right mess. And we ended up spending 6 weeks in Khartoum waiting for her to get well. But the problem with that was that the rainy season was due, and this is the long rains. And if any listeners have read about or watched films about the rainy season in monsoon country, that's what this rain is like. The raindrops are just huge. They actually hurt when they hit you if you haven't got bike gear on, and when they hit your crash helmet, you can feel your head doing this from them. So sometimes it sounds a little bit like you're riding with a machine gun just firing bullets at you. Now you can imagine what that does to dirt roads, and the road from the border between Ethiopia into Kenya and then heading south from the border crossing, just turned to quagmire. It was an absolute nightmare. Huge potholes and mud filled. Yeah. Anyway, it was horrible. I was very, very happy when it was over and done with, but we made it. Multiple fall offs. And we found ourselves a little hotel on the edge of a town called Marsabit. And this town that we woke up in, the weirdest thing I think the first thing in the morning was we'd attempted to wash ourselves and the bikes, and actually we and the bikes were still covered in red mud, and we spent the first half day with chisels chipping off terracotta pottery from the motorcycles because it was on so thick you just couldn't wash it off. So you can imagine these sort of molds of terracotta being chipped off the bike. But the next sort of lunchtime-ish, we headed off for a wander around, and this sort of takes you through a little bit of that wander around, but also so the next day's ride. Now we're out of the rainy area and we're back into desert country. Marsabit was our first taste of a sub-Saharan Old English colonial town. The buildings were either concrete or wood. The wooden houses had verandas and flower gardens. The concrete looked more official with parking spaces and an occasional flag. The poorer locals lived in a collection of shanties on the edge of the town or in rundown, paint-peeling houses, none of which, for some reason, seemed to stand up straight. In the cheerful, bustling market, we found all sorts of greens, roots, and fruits. Beside them hung hunks of meat, rolls of barbed wire, and tools with bright Made in China stickers on them. Beat-up trucks, Land Rovers, and sit-up-and-beg black bicycles worked their way patiently through the brightly coloured throng. Squawking chickens, bleating goats, and the loud calls of vendors competed with the scents of cattle dung, diesel fumes, and stagnant drainage ditches to assault our senses. The three of us were so much into the swing of relaxing after our day off that we made a silly mistake. Whilst exploring Marsabit, we'd asked as many truck drivers as we could find about the state of the road up ahead. Quite sensible, as we were about to cross the Kaisut Desert. This time, we'd woken up to a perfect biking day. It was dry, cool, and there were blue skies. In front of us lay 277 kilometers of what everyone had assured us was a bit rough but easy. It'll only take you 6 hours. We shouldn't have listened. Relaxed and reassured, we didn't set off until 10. After all, surely it wasn't going to be wet. We rode out from under Marsabit's trees and started into the desert with eager anticipation. Going into these conditions felt nice and familiar, and I was buzzing. Sunshine does that to me. Being alive and kicking after a series of hard days added to the buzz, and I was feeling safe in Kenya. I felt far more at one with what I was doing and with the bike. We'd already come a long way, and I'd learned a great deal. I was actually quite proud to have made it this far, but my mood was probably tinged with a touch of overconfidence. The shady trees disappeared behind us, with the distinctive flat-topped acacias and the softer outlines of the scrubby thorn bushes replacing them. In the distance, the horizon almost disappeared as a pale beige against a pale blue line on one side, and softened into the misty sages and violets of a mountain range on another. The road surface was mostly firm earth, with just an occasional section of washboard, and that made the ride nice and easy. It looked as if our advisors had been absolutely right. I relaxed a little more and sat back to enjoy the scenery. A few doubts began to creep into my mind as the washboard sections grew longer. These corrugations were a chore to ride. Strong winds combined with erratic rainfall, either not enough or too much, and had made little runs of ditches that lay directly across the road in front of us. They were often no more than an inch deep, but could be several inches wide. They weren't evenly spaced either, and the tops of the ridges were hard. The front wheel and the back wheel soon began to feel as if they belonged to different bikes. The books I'd read about desert riding offered two pieces of advice for dealing with washboard. One, go very slowly and just accept that it'll be a long, uncomfortable, ball battery, teeth chattering ride. Two, open the throttle until you reach a speed where you skip across the top of the ridges. The latter option, the book said, would be smoother, faster, and cause less damage to the bike, as the vibrations would be smaller. Put like that, I had no choice and opened the throttle wider. Yet again, I wasn't in complete control of my 350 kilos. Every instinct said that this was a totally mad thing to be doing, but I hung on and kept the throttle open. The bike seemed to go where it wanted to, meandering me erratically from one side of the road to the other. I began to feel that I was just some sort of biking accessory. Thankfully, the road was pretty straight, and so far we hadn't seen any other traffic. After about an hour and a half of this, I thought I saw a little mirage. It wasn't, though. Running along the roadside was a half-kilometre or so of smooth, pale ground, and I eased across to it as best I could. The pale colour was soft sand, and my 70 kilometres an hour disappeared in a blink. I was completely unprepared, and the bike landed on my foot with my boot digging its own gully in the gravel. There was a moment of silence. Then, through the still swirling dust, I heard the worrying hissing sound of fuel dropping onto hot engine. I started to feel the first touch of panic as I realized that one of the fuel taps was out of reach. My foot was firmly stuck under the engine, but at least the bike had stalled. The heat of the exhaust pipe began to work its way through the thick leather of my motorcycle boots as I lay helplessly, trying to be calm and to think what to do next. The petrol was still dripping and hissing. Riding up in front, Mike and Sally had realized that their dusty shadow was missing. Their first move was to pull the bike off me, and with that there'd been an instant rush of relief as we'd realized that there weren't any broken bones to deal with. My boot sole was almost completely ripped off, though, and I wondered what state my foot would have been in if the boots had been anything less rugged. Duct tape made for a good temporary repair. Amazingly, the bike looked pretty good, but the engine was dead.
I've always loved contradictory advice.
Do you know, but it was a good lesson to learn, wasn't it? Because it wasn't a terribly disastrous situation. I mean, the day did get very, very long because Mike and Sally took a tumble, a big tumble, and it knocked the wind out of Sally, absolutely. And Sally had total trust in Mike, and as a motocross rider, he was a very skilled rider. And Sally trusted him so much, even on roads like these where there were large potholes and so on. She would be fast asleep on the back of Mike, and she'd be like this over on one side, and you'd see her head bouncing up and down as we were going through all of these conditions. But that it was just one of those fluke situations where there was a big cloud above us, and it was raining under that cloud. It looked like just something out of a space, a science fiction movie, that this cloud had suddenly appeared and there was this rain cloud underneath it. And it was suddenly there. So there was no time to react. And Mike went down with a bang. And Sally ended up being picked up and taken to hospital by some strangers in a Land Rover. Half a dozen men just picked her up and bundled her into the back of the Land Rover. Now, at the same time, Mike's bike had lost its ability to recharge the battery. So we were then riding with the bike stalling because of the road conditions, and us having to unload all of the luggage so that we could get a battery so that we could jumpstart Mike's bike from mine, then load all the gear back on, so you can imagine what it was like. And we ended up doing this in the dark. It was such a good feeling to get to the end of that day. We'd made it. It was another challenge. What a fantastic feeling to have got our way through. The most disconcerting thing was in the dark section, we could hear the lions roaring in the bush when we broke down.
Oh, wow. Now, Of course, the more arduous a challenge is to humans, the better, story we get out of it. You can go a long way on a hissing lion story.
Too right. Too
But
right.
but what about your mindset at the time? How did you did you feel despair, or were you just focused? I mean, where was your mind in the midst of it?
I think because I've got a fairly positive outlook towards things, and I think you can find solutions to things, and being fatalistic and somewhat stoic, I suppose, things like that, when they go wrong, they don't tend to bother me too much. It's more a case of, okay, so what's the solution? How are we going to deal with this? And it was I think probably the thing that was in my mind the most was, had Sally actually managed to make it to hospital all right, or had these guys taken her off and we were never going to see her again? And that was a completely bizarre set of thoughts to have, because people are mostly great.
Yeah.
Um, and it was absolutely fine, but mostly we were just focusing on dealing with the road conditions, dealing with the checkpoints, because there were police checkpoints, because we were still heading away from border territory, and there were a lot of guns floating around in the border territory. With the war in Ethiopia having just finished, there were a lot of unpaid soldiers with guns, and they were coming down into Kenya to try and earn a living, because that was the only way they could earn a living, by the gun. So there were a lot of checkpoints, and Mike's bike did stall, and then it was the whole process of start again. So I think in the end, I think we were just too busy getting on with it to worry about it.
That's true. That's true. I one thing that I do, and perhaps you do as well, that I sometimes, and I think this is when I'm really feeling close to despair. I think at some point I'm going to have a bath, and somebody's going to hand me a martini.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
That
that
will
works.
that is somewhere in my future. I don't know when, but it's going to happen, and I would just sort of fixate on or a nice espresso or something, just to give me that thing to hang on to.
Yep. Do you know, the hotel that we stayed in that night ticked those boxes very, very nicely. We did go and find Sally, and she was in hospital, and she was being taken care of, and she hadn't got any broken bones. She was just really bruised and still shocked. Um, Mike and I booked into what was for us a posh hotel. So in other words, the room had an ensuite bath in it, and the ability to fill that bath with hot water, because we decided that if Sally was going to be really bruised, then she needed a bit of comfort and so on. And this hotel was just total luxury. It probably cost about, I don't know, I can't remember now, but let's say $3 a night. But for us, we were staying in sort of 50-cent hotels, and wild camping and so on. So it was pure luxury.
It's funny that you mentioned that, and I just want to relay a quick experience of mine and see if this parallels yours. But years ago, traveling in Peru, you kind of acclimatize to the local currency after a while. At least we did, and so there were two hotels in, I think it was Ica in Peru, and then the one hotel, which was really beautiful, was we decided it was out of our price range. So we stayed in the next hotel, which was actually sort of partially falling over. There was no ceiling in the washroom. It was $3 US a night. And we got home later and looked at each other. And the expensive hotel was $13 US a night. and yet at the time we so acclimatized to that sort of local, what stuff was worth. The idea of paying $13 a night was just outrageous.
Yeah, no, I totally get you. Birgit, my partner, she pulls my leg frequently about being a cheapskate for things like that. But I suppose, I mean, when you're on a longer trip, then every time you treat yourself to a luxury, basically has the chance of reducing the length of time that you've got to travel. So roughing it in a $3 hotel or whatever, well, that's at least one tank full of gas and a day's food that you've just saved. And I suppose your mindset just heads in that direction. But I know plenty of people who stay in nice hotels everywhere they go, because they just can't handle the sort of cockroaches and having to put your ground sheet on the bed because the sheets are so badly stained you don't sleep on them.
What's up next, Sam? What's your next piece for us?
Okay. Um, this story actually rolls on very nicely from what we were just talking about. It's really quite funny how this has worked. So I'm in Kenya and I'm heading towards Uganda. Mike and Sally and I have parted ways now. They travelled on an even smaller budget than I did, and they'd managed to get some work in Nairobi. The whole arrangement between us was very well organised right from the word go. And the arrangement was we'll travel together for as long as we're comfortable traveling together and as long as we're all wanting to head in the same direction. When it ceases to be either of those things, then yeah, we'll just part ways and enjoy all of the fantastic time that we've had together. And I love that we got that settled to begin with, because it just meant that there was no pressure on us when we were traveling together. And we did travel together for a couple of months. But this is my first day's ride when I'm back on my own again. And it felt quite strange, but there was so much to see and get involved with that I soon got back into the swing of the ride. Uganda has only just become safe to ride in after the civil war and all of the upsets that they'd been having. And in Zaire, things are still completely pots. There are very, very few people traveling down through Zaire at this time. There were some really hardy souls who were flying by the seats of their pants and were excellent guardian angels. But I was coming from the other direction and had been watching what was going on in Uganda as to was it going to be all right to head that way. Winston Churchill had called Uganda the Pearl of Africa, and I wanted to see this. Okay, so here we go. The road west along Kenya's Rift Valley took me past the wonders of the Masai Mara and Nakuru national parks. I'd still hardly seen any wildlife on the trip so far, but as the weather was right for a dash to Uganda, it made sense to do my sightseeing on the way back. Some of the game came to me, though. Sections of the main roads overlooked the Rift Valley's salt lakes, which are home to literally thousands of pink flamingos. It's a dramatic sight. The lakes seem to shimmer with the birds' beautiful colours. When something creates a scare, the sky fills with swirling lines of panicking, screeching pink. Halfway to the border, when contentedly enjoying the temperature and the mustard colours of the land, a herd of zebra charged right across the road in front of me. It was as if I'd suddenly ridden my bike through a TV screen and into a wildlife program. What a fantastic sensation. The town of Eldoret was as far as it felt comfortable to go that day, so I started my hotel hunt in plenty of time. This time, there would be no one to stand with the bike, and I went into a hotel to ask about parking, the price, and of course, whether there was any space. The jaded, old colonial New Lincoln Inn was the only place that I could find with off road parking. Even so, it was only just within my budget. To my delight, I was warmly greeted by more staff in neat burgundy uniforms. The bath in the room I was shown to was mini swimming pool size, and yes, the tap ran hot. Too lazy to explore the streets on a food hunt, the hotel restaurant seemed like a good bet and a nice treat. Faded flybone pictures decorated the three walls, and on the fourth hung a large, very serious photo of Kenya's president, Mr. Daniel Arap Moi. He looked rather uncomfortable amongst the aging memorabilia of colonial days gone by. A couple of Tusker beers helped the tough as old boots chicken slide down, and I headed for a long wallow in the tub, a perfect end to a good day on the road. The next day, I eased out of Kenya without a hiccup and slipped into Uganda with the same efficient smoothness as entry into Kenya had been. Everyone was helpful and polite. When I smiled at someone, there was always a smile back. When I said thank you, I was always given a version of "you're welcome." Customs knew what they were doing, and immigration gave me the same respect that I gave them. When they asked how long the entry permit should be, I doubled the month I'd planned, just to cover the unexpected, and was told, no problem. The rubber stamp hit the ink pad and then my passport, and I was dismissed with, have a great stay. The border marked a very obvious change in the vegetation. On the Kenyan side, it had been mainly mustard and sage, bush or farmland. In Uganda, The difference was dramatic. Everything was suddenly green. Green grass, green bushes, green trees. After trundling on through the tidy lines of banana and tea plantations, I had to twist my leg to look up at the first trees I'd seen of any real size in Africa. The shade was so dense in some sections that it actually felt cold, and I could smell as well as feel the temperature changes. The roads took me swooping and curving through the land and deposited me in Butterfly Valley. Literally thousands of butterflies filled the air, and the road seemed to be almost carpeted by these stunning multicolored creatures. I could only get through by riding at a snail's pace, and wondered how many were killed each day in their search for whatever they were looking for in this particular valley. Then a truck blasted past me, killing more in a few seconds than I could have done in 10 minutes of wanton slaughter. I rode on. It was a delight to see the local women walking along the roadsides with bundles piled high on their heads. Their dresses were always an eclectic clash of bright colours. These were wrapped around them in such a way that their head-on basket posture made them look more elegant, to my mind, than the highest of Paris fashions could have done. The fruit stalls that lined the roadsides were loaded with the colours of mangoes, pineapples, oranges, and bananas. These vivid splashes of colour rivaled the dresses for vibrancy. The road surface was absolutely fantastic, and for once I was able to hear the drumming noise from the tread on my enduro tyres. I was tickled by the road signs too. Driving on the hard shoulder is prohibited. That was a good one. Until now, everyone had driven wherever they thought the smoothest bit would be. Spilling of petroleum-based liquids on the road is prohibited. Some hope. Drivers often did their oil changes by the roadside. The old oil just emptied into the sand. But, in true African style, there were no signposts for Uganda's capital city, Kampala.
You know what struck me from earlier in that excerpt, Sam, was when you said the tap ran hot. And until you've traveled, those words don't resonate in the way that they do, after day of at best lukewarm water. To get to a place with hot water really is just it's joyous, isn't it?
It's absolute bliss, and I was so suspicious of this bathtub because, it was an old colonial bathtub, and you could probably have sat cross-legged 4 adults in this thing. It was massive. It felt like a swimming pool to me. I could literally float in this bath. So when I looked at the size of it, I thought, there is no way there's going to be enough hot water. If I'm lucky, I might get 3 inches, and I couldn't believe it. The tap just kept on pouring out more and more and more hot water. And I spent quite a long time in there. Wrinkle fingers and toes time.
It really is. And of course, you mentioned the colonial influence, and it really is shocking when you travel in certain parts of the world too. We know of the long reach of England at one point in history, but it really is shocking when you go to a place, like Victoria Falls or something like that in Africa, and you see that it's kind of shocking that at that point, and it's almost the equivalent is the reach of some of the Roman Catholic churches I've seen in the far Arctic. It's like just to get there today is arduous.
Yep.
But 150 years ago, it's really shocking, isn't it? The long reach of colonialism.
It is, and in some ways, I have great respect for colonialism because they built an awful lot of roads and infrastructure and that sort of thing. But I have absolute horror at how they drew their borders, for example. So the border between Kenya and Tanzania, that's right smack through the middle of the Maasai tribe. So all of a sudden you've got Maasai on one side of the border and Maasai on the other side of the border, and technically they're different nationalities and they're not allowed to visit each other. Well, how nuts is that? There was an awful lot that the colonialists did that was just incredibly, incredibly wrong, just through pure ignorance. And I said that my parents were working in the Congo. They went out because it was a Belgian colony that actually belonged to King Leopold of Belgium. And it was pretty much under his rule genocide that was happening there. Yeah. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. And just absolutely appalling.
What shocks me sometimes when you're as a white person traveling in these places is given the history of white folks is problematic if you're not white, is how generous and receptive they are.
No, a lot of that depends on who the person they're dealing with is.
Yeah.
I'm a great believer in a handshake and a smile. And I can tell many stories of when I've been in an official situation and the officials have been looking at me with disdain. But as soon as I've gone over to them and using their title and a handshake and a smile and said, pleasantries, good morning, what a beautiful day, whatever else it might be, just watching the tension just suddenly disappear because you've treated this person with the respect that so many other people don't treat them with. Treating everyday people, I soon realized that many of the people that I was meeting in the villages and so on in Africa, they were more afraid of me than I was uneasy about them.
Yes, that's true.
I was the stranger in their strange land, but they had a whole history where the white man was somebody who did a lot of grim things. But again, that handshake and the smile and yeah, absolutely brilliant. I believe when you're traveling, you trust everybody until they prove that they don't need to be trusted. And the longer you travel, the faster your senses get honed as to which people, after the first couple of sentences of greeting and that smile and a handshake, yeah, they're dodgy.
And I think as motorcyclists, we generally look fairly impoverished. So I don't think anyone who would try to benefit from getting in our face really, they'll go somewhere else.
I think you're absolutely right about that. And in Africa, one of the things that I discovered was that a motorcycle is the best icebreaker out. I was meeting people who either rode motorcycles and wanted to talk motorcycles, and their motorcycle might well be a 125 beaten up, clapped out old thing that's held together with baling twine and bits of string. But they were still motorcyclists.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And I was meeting other people that would just love to have a motorcycle. And yeah, obviously we're never going to, but it didn't stop the desire to have the conversations going. I loved that. And I often found that officials were motorcyclists. It may be that they had a 25-mile commute on a 50cc moped to get to work at their border station. That sort of stuff was going on. So yeah, motorcycles, they're great icebreakers, aren't they?
Well, also to just, I mean, this is really your first. I mean, every day. I mean, a lot of motorcyclists would ride for years and years and not be able to tackle this. But you, I mean, the gloriousness of ignorance, I suppose, isn't it? I mean, you were really just. I mean, some of the riding conditions, how arduous they were, and I mean, maybe it was better that you didn't know any better.
Yeah, it was. I don't think of myself as being particularly brave. My mother used to say that I had a strong streak of stupidity, which means that I'll have a go at things that perhaps I ought not to have a go at. I am a great believer in if you don't try something, then you'll never find out if you can. And it's such a great thing to have in mind when living life as a whole. But yeah, ignorance sometimes is bliss. Sometimes it's just completely the wrong thing. But not knowing how bad things were going to be and just having to get on with them because they were in front of me, that was good.
Into Africa, as well as Sam's other books, can be found via sam-manicom.com, your local bookseller, or Amazon. In closing words from eBay Motors. Picture this, you're halfway through a DIY motorcycle fix, tools scattered everywhere, and boom, you realize you're missing a part. Well, it's okay because whatever it is, it's on eBay. They've got everything. Brake rotors, lights, and tire exhaust systems, whatever you need. And it's guaranteed to fit, which means no more crossing your fingers and hoping you ordered the right thing. All the parts you need at prices you'll love. Guaranteed to fit. Every time. eBay. Things people love. Thank you for listening to The Lowdown Show.